Well, officials from the United States and China have set a very positive framework ahead of upcoming trade talks. U.S. President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says. Speaking on the sidelines of the Asian summit in Malaysia, Bessent stresses that any extension of a trade truce between China and the U.S. would be President Donald Trump's decision.
This whole framework for the leaders to discuss on Thursday. We discussed trade, rare earths, the fentanyl, TikToks, and the overall relationship between the two countries. I'm not going to get ahead of the president, but I think we have the very substantial negotiations here, and there will be some new nuance to them.
Will the trade truce be extended?
Coming out of this meeting, I would say yes, but that is, at the end of the day, President Trump's decision. Yes, this is the fifth time that the Vice Premier Hu Feng and I have seen each other. It was great respect, and I think what was different this time is this was in preparation for the meeting with the two leaders. So we were determined to provide them for a framework for a successful meeting in Korea, which I think it will be.
Still on Trump and his visit to the Asian summit, China has reached a preliminary consensus in its trade negotiations with the United States. Chinese top trade negotiator Li Chenggang says at the trade talks in Malaysia, the talks are being held days ahead of a meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in South Korea.
After more than a day of intensive discussions, China and the United States further explored solutions for properly addressing each other's concerns on the aforementioned issues, reaching preliminary consensus. The two sides engaged in constructive discussions during which the U.S. side articulated its position firmly, while China steadfastly safeguarded its interests.
Joining me now, Global Affairs expert Dr. Odermann to discuss Trump's tour of Asia and his anticipated meeting with Xi Jinping. She'll also discuss what Trump's been up to lately, especially with the Thailand and Cambodia, peace deal and trade talks with China reaching a preliminary phase. She's live from the UAE. Good to have you this weekend. Like we discussed earlier, I'm very sure sticking to 1 minute to each question will make so much sense, Dr. Kari. Now, how did Trump's threats to block trade deals influence Cambodia and Thailand's decision to negotiate a peace agreement?
I don't think we can underestimate the fact that the tariffs on India made Trump's threats credible in Southeast Asia. And he prioritized this, making it his first stop in Kuala Lumpur to be part of this peace negotiation. The conflict wasn't that big, but it had displaced thousands, and it restricted the movement of goods and supply chains, which the U.S. prioritized. And if you compare this with how the U.S. is reacting to other conflicts, which perhaps later we'll come to, you'll see that this was unique, and it shows that the United States is really looking at its national interests in terms of economy.
So what role did Trump's, personal relationship with the leaders of Cambodia and Thailand play in facilitating the peace talks?
Well, both of them mentioned how important it was that he's there. And we can't forget that interactions like this take place not only on the international level, but also domestically. And having an interaction with the U.S. president has traditionally been very easy to leverage domestically. The last U.S. president to meet with a state leader in Cambodia was 2012 with Barack Obama, and it was 2003 George W. Bush met with the Thai leader. So this was very important that a U.S. president was there, and it also allowed both leaders to save face.
So, but precisely, right, there's a talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. But what message does Trump's involvement send to other nations in the region about the U.S.'s commitment to peace and diplomacy? And also, do you see a Nobel Peace Prize in the works soon?
I see that any country that is going to invite Donald Trump to help them negotiate anything is going to mention the Nobel Peace Prize. It's something that he likes to hear very much. And if I was a country that needed some type of litigation or some type of support from the US, there are very certain steps I would take now that seem to be effective in getting Donald Trump's attention.
Absolutely. Now we'll move to other regions, especially with the fact that, he's trying to have peace here and peace there with the India and the Pakistan. A lot of people are wondering now how his approach to diplomacy in, this instance compared to his efforts in other conflict zones.
That's a good point. If you look at how the United States and especially the Trump administration has dealt with Greenland, Ukraine, and Venezuela, it's quite different. There's always a mix of personal engagement, economic leverage, and a lot of public showmanship. But Southeast Asia is critically important for US interests because of the economic potential, the strategic location, and the supply chain significance. So it's become a priority also in the US's competition with China. This has played a role. So it's not surprising that they're dealing with peace in Southeast Asia different than in other areas.
But what impact might this peace agreement have on the global stage, particularly regarding Trump's reputation as a diplomat?
Well, the question is, how long do these peace deals that he's negotiated or these conflicts that he's ended really do end? And in any situation, it comes down to security guarantees and what the US or other participants are willing to factor into making sure that these peace deals stick. And in Ukraine, that's been a problem. In Israel, the peace deal didn't last very long before the conflict reopened in some areas again. So Trump's reputation as a peacemaker, analysts and observers see that differently in different regions.
To the China-US trade talks, that's also one of the top stories today. How can the US effectively address the significant trade imbalance with China, which has led to substantial job losses and economic disruption in certain industries in the United States?
Well, there is an election coming up, a midterm election in the United States, and the effects on the US economy are hard to miss. And these attempts are a way to try to make sure that votes aren't lost in this upcoming election. And it's going to be hard to really win ground back. One of the things the US needs to focus on is becoming more independent in certain areas. So it's not dependent on supply chains. And it also needs to make sure that the choke points in the Taiwan Straits, for example, are well secured, and that there is not a potential that they would lose out on important elements that they need, especially when we're talking about chip manufacturing.
So one's wondering now, is there even any strategy that the U.S. can employ to ensure China adheres to trade agreements and intellectual property rights, given concerns about unfair trade practices? And like you said, dependency plays a key role when it comes to, such negotiations or, trade imbalance.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that the US needs to do, and it's not necessarily only in terms of the economics behind things. The entire world order is shifting, and to expect then that certain agreements would be respected like they were in the past, that's shifting too. And the United States is one of the only countries in the world that can slow down this global change that's happening, but they've opted not to do that. And we have to start looking at everything in terms or through a security lens. And when you look at it in terms of security, the United States has a very big problem in terms of software that's been discovered, backdoors that can control municipal water systems, that can control factories, electrical grids, streetlights, and surveillance systems that have been traced back to China. So it's not only about making sure the US economy is strong and trying to settle things with China, but it's about making the United States as secure and not just buying cheaper products from China that are manufactured in China, because there's also security risk that has to be recognized.
You brought up the issue of security. We're getting into that shortly, but how can the U.S. balance its needs to protect domestic industries with the potential risk of escalating trade tensions and higher prices for consumers? Because at the end of the day, this issue of trade talks affects mostly the consumers.
It does. And I think that it's doing the consumers a huge disservice by saying that it doesn't. And that seems to have been what the Trump administration has been trying to convince the electorate, that these things are necessary and they won't affect them. Now in the United States, we're starting to see people realize how the tariffs on China have affected their daily lives. Also, the sanctions that Trump just recently put on Russia are going to cause oil prices to go up. So his actions, and as was mentioned, he's being allowed to decide things himself. And I don't know if he's taking the advice of people around him that would truly help strengthen the US economy right now.
Brings in the role of WTO. What can, international institutions like the World Trade Organization play in resolving trade disputes, not just between the US and China, but globally?
I had the opportunity to speak with Pascal Lamy, who was the former chair of the WTO recently, and I asked him if he considers the organization still relevant. And it's relevant if you want to pursue peaceful ways of resolving global trade disputes. And you have to prioritize that to make that organization remain relevant. When you prevent trade wars, you strengthen countries. And the WTO was once considered the cornerstone of global trade, but it's losing its relevance because there's a loss of trust, because there's been a loss of compliance. And there's also a situation where there is some arbitration framework where members can block. So things have come to a standstill, and it's become less of a constructive avenue to use to celebrate trade disputes. So is it still relevant? It's relevant in the sense that if you're supporting rule of law and international structures that support a certain type of world order, but those things can only exist if everyone agrees that they're important.
Now, I'm also glad you brought up the issue of, insecurity, AI, US being, self-sufficient and all of that. That brings me to the question, how can the U.S. maintain its technological edge and protect its intellectual property in the face of China's growing technology, that's the capability and potential security threats? Plus, what are the implications of China's growing influence in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, 5G networks for U.S.'s economy and, national security?
Well, that's a lot to unpack there. Let's look first at let's look at Temu. Let's look at the fact that the Temu app, which is an e-commerce app where people around the world have been purchasing really low-priced products. In the United States, it's been discovered, or they've been accused of using people's telephones, microphones and cameras to monitor and ruin people's privacy. And on top of that, we also need to consider not only AI, but also the Chinese are leading in creating sophisticated algorithms, which are behind apps like TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, based in China. And then there's other ways of influencing people through technology. The release of DeepSeek, which was the Chinese-based version of ChatGPT, was creating outputs that don't necessarily align with the facts, but align more with Chinese strategic values and a Chinese version of historical events. So you've got these different ways technology is being used, not only to gain a foothold in certain markets, but also to influence entire societies.
And we stuck to that 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrie, for the time. She's a global affairs expert. We had to touch on the major stories from the U.S. today.